There are two types of analysis that we are going to look into it. One is called as the one-way ANOVA and the second one is called as the two-way ANOVA. There is a difference between them. Now this is really fantastic enough to, in a one-way ANOVA, there are two possible hypotheses. They are going to have the same weight throughout the year altogether, and there are two or three categorical groups that as I have mentioned. Good morning and welcome to the first session in Unit 1 in Business Research Methods, where we are going to speak about the method of analysis, and there we are going to use about ANOVA and the analysis of variance. So analysis of variance is going to be a very important topic in terms of doing your statistical research. Now moving further, a key statistical test in the research field, including biology, economics, psychology, we are going to use this method called as ANOVA. ANOVA is very useful for analyzing data sets. Now, what is this analysis of variance all about? Now, for example, there is a data set available for doing a research. Now, when you're doing multiple data sets research based, there is a variance in terms of the factor. Now, we are going to measure that variance. So, in order to measure that variance, we are going to do this analysis of variance. Now, it allows the comparisons to be made between three or more groups of data. So, as I was telling you, when you have multiple sets of data, you will get into a comparative mode of measuring the variance across the field. So that's where we are coming in order to measure the variance factor, and we will come to know how this variance comes into picture. Now the next thing is that we are going to summarize the key differences between these two tests, including the assumptions and hypotheses that must be made about each type of test. So this is also a very important thing that I would like to talk upon today. Why? Because when we are summarizing the key differences between these two tests, including the assumption and hypothesis, we are going to know what is an hypothesis in a short while, and that must be also understood, that must be also made about from each of the tests that we are taking. Now there are two types of analysis of variance, the one-way ANOVA and the two-way ANOVA. So there are two types of analysis that we are going to look into it. One is called as the one-way ANOVA and the second one is called as the two-way ANOVA. Now moving further, what is the one-way ANOVA all about? The one-way analysis of variance is a statistical test that compares the variance in the group's mean within the sample while it's considered only one independent variable or factor. There's only one independent variable or factor that is going to be taken into picture. So when I say a one-way ANOVA, it is a single-way statistical test that compares the variance in the groups well within it. Then it is an hypothesis-based test. So we are going to understand the word hypothesis, where we are going to assume certain thing and we are going to have an alternative hypothesis for also. Now it's an hypothesis-based test, meaning that it aims to evaluate multiple mutually exclusive theory about our data. So there is an assumption factor which is already being taken into picture, and using the ANOVA, we are going to do this multiple theory analysis. We are going to find out whether mutually this is going to work out, this is going to be sounding good enough in terms of our data analysis. Followed by the one-way ANOVA compares three or more categorical groups to establish whether there is a difference between them. Now this is really fantastic enough to see and measure and talk about. Why? Because when we talk about this ANOVA, when we talk about this comparison factors altogether, compares three or more than three category groups to establish whether there is a difference between them. So that means when a researcher is involved in doing multiple sets of data and he wants to get a clarity in terms of the picture, in terms of how it has been done, where it has been taken, I think ANOVA would stand as the best methodology to understand the variance factors altogether. Now, within each group, when we are talking about, there should be 3 or more observations that has to be done, and the means of samples are being compared. So definitely within a group there are different observations, and the means of the samples would be considered, would be looked into using this one-way ANOVA test. Now, going further, in a one-way ANOVA, there are 2 possible hypotheses. Now, let's first try to understand hypothesis here. Hypothesis means an assumption that is made by the researcher during the research. So, there is going to be 2 parts of the hypothesis, a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. Now, what is a null hypothesis? A null hypothesis is that there is no difference between the groups and equality between the means. Now, for example, I'm just taking a factor here, Wallace weigh same in different months. Now, if I'm going to look into an animal called as C. Wallaces, I'm just making a statement. They are going to have the same weight throughout the year altogether. The alternate hypothesis to that will be Wallace will have different weights in different months. So, moment I am predicting a null hypothesis where I say that there is not going to be much of change, there's just going to be an equality everywhere, no difference factor at all. Alternative hypothesis is going to pitch in, that is going to make a difference between the means and the group. So alternative would challenge the null hypothesis, saying that yes, there is another way of looking at it. There is another way, another mean of looking into it altogether. There is a possibility altogether. So that's why we have null hypothesis and we have the alternative hypothesis. Now, moving further, because of the two-way ANOVA. Now, why is the hypothesis, what are the hypotheses that's going to be considered of the two-way ANOVA? Because of the two-way ANOVA, consider the effect of 2 categorical factors. The effect of the categorical factors on each other. There are 3 pairs of null or alternative hypothesis for the two-way ANOVA. So this is very, very interesting for all of us to do. Why? Because when you start looking into this factor of two-way ANOVA, so both sides we are going to do the comparison, evaluate the factor, and categorically we are going to see the effects that are going to happen on the situation. Difference between the one-way and the two-way ANOVA. One-way ANOVA is primarily designed to enable equality testing between 3 or more means. The two-way ANOVA is designed to assess the interrelationship. Very, very important. It is designed to, measure the interrelationship between 2 independent variables on a dependent factor. So now, let's say that X is the dependent factor and A and B are 2 independent factors. So we are going to see the dependency factor. In what way are they related? In what way are they going to assess the interrelationship factor here? The one-way ANOVA involves only 1 factor or an independent variable, whereas the two-way ANOVA, they will have more than 2 independent variables. So that's why there is a difference that is coming into picture here. Followed by the difference between the one-way and the two-way ANOVA that we are talking about also includes the 1 factor or independent variable has already been analyzed, and there are 2 or 3 categorical groups that, as I have mentioned. Followed by a two-way ANOVA instead compares the multiple aspects here of the 2 group factors. So that's why the two-way ANOVA process will try to compare only between the 2 different groups itself. One-way ANOVA need to satisfy only 1 principle of design, replication or randomization, whereas as opposed the two-way ANOVA, which meets all the 3 principles of design experiments, which has got no replication, randomization or local control. So that's a different process, different level altogether. Now, most of the time, we go in for this two-way ANOVA when the design is slightly complicated or it involves a lot of thought process involved. So, when we look for complex biological examples, we definitely like to go in for a two-way ANOVA process. Why? Because that will be able to understand, highlight, and tell exactly what is happening in terms of the difference in variance. When I'm using a one-way ANOVA process, we will not be getting into much of complexity because there's only one factor taken towards one independent variable and we will just measure the relationship there. Now, with that, I come to the end of this particular session. I hope and believe that this session was of great help and resource to you. In the upcoming session, we are going to learn more about the analysis of variance and we are going to see the impact of the same in the research methodology. Until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.